Well, hello, everybody. I'm glad that we have 24 people on the call, and I'm hopefully able to see the webinar in front of you and the slides as well. I am with AARP Massachusetts, as Heidi said, and we are delighted to offer you this opportunity to do a deeper dive into learning about a very important area of the housing work that you're considering. We have two fabulous experts on ADUs with us today. The National AARP office that works on the age-friendly network contracted with them and has offered this opportunity to a limited number of states. We were fortunate to be given this opportunity for Massachusetts. And at this moment, we do indeed have members of the MAGIC MAPC network on the line and on the computers with us, but I'm really happy that we're recording this and able to make this available to the rest of the network and others interested in this after today. So I just wanted to indicate to you that this is perhaps just the beginning of a conversation with some additional help afterwards from our colleagues that we'll hear from shortly. And it is, again, something that the National Office AARP has afforded the network in Massachusetts as we look to grow your best practices and your success around all the domains, and in this case, the housing domain. And stay tuned later in the year for more efforts that we'll provide to grow the network and the support that you get as you do the fantastic work that you're doing. And of course, MAGIC is a very strong subset of the 31 communities in Massachusetts that are working on becoming age-friendly. So with that, I want to introduce Eli Spevak and Kol Peterson. Eli, both of them are from Portland, Oregon. We're going to want to move there or at least take a trip there after hearing from them, I'm sure. And so a little bit about both of them. Eli moved to Portland in 1994 and was a construction supervisor with Habitat for Humanity. He managed the finance and construction of over 250 units of affordable housing through work in the nonprofit sector. He served on the board of Portland's Community Land Trust for its first 5 years and worked with the residents of Dignity Village, a self-built homeless camp, during its first 2 years. After taking a year off to work as a backcountry ranger, Eli launched a development and general contractor company, Orange Splot, which is the company that we are hearing from today. And the goal was to pioneer new models of community-oriented housing. He completed projects that were featured in the New York Times and Sunset Magazine, and his most recent community, Cully Grove, just received a 2016 AIA Housing Award. He's led tiny house bike tours, advocated for regulatory changes to support accessory dwellings, and he co-founded a website that you may have already checked out called accessorydwellings.org. He also got a fellowship that brought him to Harvard and graduate work between 2013 and 2014. And since then, he's participated in Portland's residential infill project to reform zoning in single-dwelling areas, co-founded an advocacy organization called Portland for Everyone to support diverse, abundant, and affordable housing, and he now serves on Portland's Planning and Sustainability Commission. That's Eli Spevak. Kol Peterson, also with us today, is an ADU expert also from Portland who has helped catalyze the exponential growth of ADUs in Portland over the last decade through ADU advocacy, education, consulting, policy work, and entrepreneurship. And he's the author of Backdoor Revolution, the definitive guide to ADU development. He's the owner of Caravan, the tiny house hotel, the first tiny house hotel in the world, and an organizer of Portland's popular ADU tour. He consults with homeowners about ADUs on their property and teaches ADU classes for homeowners and for real estate agents in Oregon, Washington, and California. And he also edits the website that I referred to before, accessorydwellings.org, and also buildinganadu.com. He developed and lived in a detached new construction ADU in 2011 and developed a basement garage conversion ADU in 2018, and also has roots from Massachusetts with a master's degree in environmental planning from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. So prior to that, he was working with the federal government for 10 years in D.C. And Oregon. So that we've clearly got two fabulous experts on ADUs, and let's just look forward to hearing from them and learning from them today and discussing many things. Thank you so much, and welcome from AARP Massachusetts and from the AARP National Office.
So this is Kol. I think I'll start, and meanwhile, if you guys can try to figure out how to unmute Eli, that would be good. So thanks so much for joining today. And if you want to give me control, I could manage the slides, or you can advance them. So we're going to talk about ADUs today and go over some best practices regarding building public education and support for ADUs. And Eli, whenever you're able to, talk, you can just jump in. So thanks so much. We're admittedly, we're both, Eli and I are kind of Portland focused, or we have a lot of experience in Portland, but we're both kind of really trying to help other jurisdictions across the country kind of get going on the process of getting more ADUs built. And as you all might know, while ADUs have been a lauded idea amongst urban planners and architects and a lot of different advocates for years, not many are being built. And so there's this big gap between the interest in ADUs and the actual reality of ADUs. So, so this presentation is intended to kind of go over some of the best practices regarding getting support for ADUs and getting better education about ADUs out there. So if you could advance to the next slide, that would be great. I can't do that, so. There we go. All right, so we already got our little introductions, and we can advance to the next slide. All right, so this is, ADUs have a lot of different names. Admittedly, the term accessory dwelling unit is a bad name, and we're open to other ideas, but honestly, there's like 65 different names for ADUs that I've counted and counting, from carriage houses, granny flats, in-law suites, mother-in-law flats, sidekicks, laneway houses, and all of the rest of them. And so there is a lot of different names for these things, but we're talking about secondary housing units on single-family lots. That's what an ADU is. We're not talking about duplexes. We're not talking about triplexes or fourplexes, and we're not generally talking about additional units on commercial lots, or say, an ADU is by definition only a housing form that's relevant on residential lots in general, because they're only allowed to be built in as an accessory or ancillary unit to a primary dwelling unit. So if you have a primary dwelling unit on a lot and ADUs are allowed, then you can build an ADU, but you can't, like if you had a commercially zoned lot with a primary house on it, you could theoretically build an ADU, but most people have residential, build ADUs on residential properties. So we're going to go to the next slide here. All right. So an ADU, as I discussed, we're going to go to the next slide here. Move on. All right, so there's a number of different ADU types that are out there in existence. There's detached backyard cottage-style ADUs. There's garage conversion ADUs. There's internal ADUs and basement ADUs and ADUs above a garage. There's all these different structural forms of ADUs that are potentially options, but that isn't to say that every jurisdiction necessarily allows for all of these different structural forms of ADUs to be used on a property. And so that gets into regulations quickly, but needless to say, from an advocacy point of view, it would be best if all different structural forms of ADUs were allowable forms of ADUs. Now in Massachusetts, I suspect there's a lot of jurisdictions that only allow for internal ADUs or attached ADUs, but in Portland and other cities that are seeing a lot more ADUs, relatively speaking, all different structural forms are viable. So I'm going to advance now. All right, and so more different versions of different structural forms of ADUs here, an ADU above a garage. And in fact, Eli, who's the co-presenter today, developed an ADU as a condo, which we can talk about momentarily. Then we have here like what are classified as detached bedrooms. They're not actually ADUs. They look like ADUs if you don't, if from the outside they might as well be an ADU. But what they lack that ADUs have is a kitchen sink and stove connection. So if a unit has a kitchen sink and stove connection, it should theoretically be classified as an ADU. If it doesn't have those two things, then it's actually just a detached, or it's habitable living space, but it's not actually an ADU. So when you really boil down the building code, it has to do with, you know, the kitchen sink and stove connection. Oh, Eli is saying maybe I should skip ahead, but why don't I'll just keep going, Eli, until you get on, because this should work out okay. So tiny homes on wheels. These are cute things that have gotten a lot of attention as of late, but they're not actually legal to live in anywhere in the United States, in residential areas anyway. So that's one of the primary drawbacks of tiny houses on wheels over ADUs. That said, you know, they've gotten a lot of, if nothing else, they've gotten a lot of attention in the media, and that's brought a lot of attention to small housing, and so that's a good thing. Eli owns tiny houses on wheels, and this one, and I own Caravan, the tiny house hotel. So we're both familiar with tiny houses on wheels, and we're both fans of them. But unfortunately, you know, the codes in jurisdictions don't really allow for these right now. So, so they're not really the same as ADUs in that way. But we can certainly talk about tiny houses on wheels if there are some questions that arise from this presentation. Okay, I'm going to advance to the next slide. If somebody could help me do that, that would be great. All right. So, so ADUs are, you know, there's a lot of different reasons why people are interested in ADUs. Social, economic, environmental reasons. This is a great, you know, example from a show that we all know, where the Fonz was living in an ADU above the garage in the backyard of Richie's place. So they've been around for a while. These things are not new. It's, you know, in fact, the term ADU is kind of new, but this form of housing has been around for, you know, since the beginning of mankind, or people kind. I'm going to advance to the next slide if somebody could help me with that. Could somebody advance to the next slide? Thanks. So there is a lack of housing choices out there on the marketplace right now. There's a lot of single-family homes happening in, you know, across the U.S. According to the U.S. Census, the 2010 census data. The majority of homes that are being developed, roughly, you know, half of homes are basically large single-family homes. And I say large because the average size of homes is quite like 2,600 square feet. Then there's some multifamily, you know, development happening in certain areas where zoning allows for it. There's just not a lot of kind of like smaller housing options available for a variety of reasons. So that's kind of like what's going on the ground right now with regard to the supply of housing that's out there on the market. Could somebody please advance to the next slide? Thanks. So missing middle housing has gotten a lot of attention over the last year or two. This is a concept that looks at what we could do within single-family residential zones to basically allow for this whole range of housing types that aren't really being built anymore because of zoning laws having changed over the years, over the decades since like the 20s, to become a lot more strict. So if there were a complete free market, one would presume that duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes would be built in great abundance in residential zones like they used to be back in the early 1900s. But now zoning tends not to allow for that. It kind of segregates out single-family zoning from anything else. And so there's this huge of single-family zoning right now that is out there that doesn't have an opportunity to really create the type of housing supply that is needed out there. And we'll get into what that means in a minute. Could we go to the next slide, please? All right, so ADUs are adaptable. They work well over time. This slide at the top here is like the quintessential ADU slide that summarizes some of the interesting facets of ADUs. So this family in 2010 is living in the primary house, renting out this ADU in the back. 2020, they become a nuclear family with 2.3 kids, move into the primary house and the ADU. In 2040, they become empty nesters.
Hello?
ADU, start renting the primary house. Eli, you're in.
Check one, check two. I'm in. What do you know?
Hey, so let me just finish off that one sentence and then I'll hand it over to you. So,
sounds good.
So there's three things here that are really fascinating about this slide. Number one, we know from a 2013 survey that was conducted about ADUs in Portland, the only statistically valid survey of ADUs in the U.S. to date was one in Portland 2013, and there's another one just came out recently. We know from that study that the number one motivation behind why people want to build ADUs is passive rental income potential. The second most common motivation is multi-generational, flexible housing for multi-generational households. But the third thing that's kind of interesting here is, you know, this couple is able to stay on this property for a long period of time. Now, we don't know for a fact that people are actually going to be able to live on their properties with ADUs for 30 years because the average time that people live on their property right now is like 5 to 7 years in the U.S. But one can assume that by building in this additional small housing unit, you're providing this type of flexibility on this property where people want to age in place and not leave their neighborhood that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And so it would be interesting to study in, say, 20 years, once ADUs have been around for a while, do in fact owners of properties with ADUs tend to stay on their property for longer periods of time? I don't know, you know, we don't have the data to back it up, but I'm going to presume that that is the case. And also that means with it that people tend to really care about the properties that they're building these ADUs on because they have a long-term vested interest in the property. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Eli and let you continue. Thanks, Eli.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Cole, for chipping in. I've never had someone present the slide deck that you were not expecting to do, and I was, so that worked out great. I'm going to take control here and see if it lets me advance to the next slide. I'm trying to advance the next slide. Can someone else please do that for me? Thank you. So the next advantage of ADUs is, and this is a good talking point, especially as people are getting older and younger families are forming, is it provides a perfect venue for multi-generational housing where you've got, I can't tell you how many times someone has come to Portland. I get a phone call from someone saying, could you build an ADU? I'm moving here to be near my grandkid who just got born. Or people who want to live in the back house so that the family can live up front. Let's see if I can. And then the demographics, as AARP, thanks for hosting this, are totally aware. We're seeing, since the 1950s, an explosion in house size at the same time that our household size has been diminishing. So from 1950, the average home size was 983 square feet. In 2008, it was 2,500 square feet. Since then, it's gone up only beyond that. The square footage of house per person has more than tripled from 260 to 960 during that time horizon. And if you look at the upright chart there where it says share of households by size 1970, it's a little hard to read, but the green area is the number of households that are 3 or more people. And I'm going to click through 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and you'll see that by then almost 2/3 of households were 1 or 2 people. And yet the housing stock we're building in most residential neighborhoods is bigger than we've ever built before. So those people who are advocating for ADUs, and I hope that this series of slides will give you some talking points if you don't already have them all at your fingertips, is that we really have a mismatch between the housing supply that we're creating on the ground and the households who are actually living in our communities. When we were starting to advocate in Portland to support accessory dwelling units, it wasn't during an affordable housing crisis. It was during a time when we had a green building industry that was growing into maturity, and there was a frustration that we're building these 6,000 square foot LEED Platinum homes when we had this instinct that really just building a smaller house is more climate friendly. And Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality has done some great research to document exactly this dynamic, where they found that 80% of houses climate impact over the lifespan of the house is related to heating, lighting, and plug loads and water usage. Only a very small part of a house's climate impacts relate to the materials, embodied energy, replacing roofing, things like that. So by far the best thing you can do for the environment is to build a smaller house or an attached house. And that's going to be even more true in the Northeast climate, where you've got more severe temperature swings than it is in relatively mild Northwest. So there's a great environmental benefits for just having smaller homes, more important than many other things to get more attention, frankly, in the green building industry. Affordability. One of the things ADUs allow is for the people to provide their own safety net. As we studied the rent levels for accessory dwelling units, we found that they follow generally the bell curve you'd expect for rentals, maybe a little bit more than the same size rental in an apartment development nearby. But then we found that almost 20% of them are rented for zero or incredibly below market rent. And that means that someone is providing de facto affordable housing for someone who maybe it's a loved one or a family member or a friend, but that person will be otherwise out competing on the market for their housing. And ADUs are used regularly to provide safety net housing without any public subsidy, or maybe you waive some impact fees or development fees, but they're not very compatible with the traditional affordable housing development industry with tax credits and rental housing, but they are used that way pretty often, more often than we expected. They're also a great niche for small contractors and emerging architects. A lot of the ADUs in Portland, they're just kind of too small for a spec home builder. But they're great for people to get started, and especially in communities where you're always trying to nurture the next round of builders and designers. It's a proven way people get started. A few more things that we talked about with related to ADUs as we're trying to build public support for them. One of them is that there's a lot of neighborhoods, and I should say Kol and I both have spent time living in the Boston area, and I've seen a lot of antagonistic attitude towards development of existing single-family neighborhoods, and I know there's some state-level work on that as well. But of all the ways you can slip more homes into existing established neighborhoods, ADUs seem to be the most politically palatable. There are other ideas too. You do corner duplexes, cottage clusters, internal divisions of existing homes. All those are also examples of discrete ways of getting a little more density with a dispersed impact. But ADUs seem to go over really well politically. And I think it's because almost everyone can relate to some time in their own lives or in a friend's life or loved ones where an ADU is the perfect housing match for them. So it feels very real. And there's also that history that they've been around in our culture for a long time. You might say we're just trying to re-legalize them now. Another thing that we talk about is, I lost the page here. Okay, life safety. When we passed it in Portland, we had a fire commissioner in city council, and they've seen a lot of homes that have some lingering life safety issue, and it's not going to get fixed if it's an illegal ADU, but once it goes legal, it'll get fixed. Aging in place, we've talked about that already, where people just want to be able to stay in the neighborhood even if they can't afford, don't want to maintain that 2,000 square foot home they raised a family in. And then there's a libertarian argument that gained a lot of traction in California's push to say, why shouldn't I be allowed to do an ADU? I've got a 5-bedroom house. Why can't I put a side door on it? I'll try and skip to the next. And then the alliance that came together to help support ADUs in the Northwest that you guys might be able to do similarly in Massachusetts is Affordable Housing Advocates. Only a few of them might build them, but they all recognize the need for more housing supply at lower income levels. Environmental groups for climate reasons. CLF, you've got the Conservation Law Fund out in New England. The Green Building Community, that was the initial impetus here in the Portland area. Smart growth organizations, renter advocacy groups, AARP, housing preservation groups. Seattle just did a great study showing that if there's people concerned about houses being torn down and redeveloped, one of the best things you can do is allow someone to build an ADU that decreases the likelihood that the main house gets torn down, because it provides an opportunity to invest, increase the living area and the value of the property while you keep the existing house in place. Libertarians, I mentioned, tiny home advocates are incredibly well organized, and a lot of people dream of a tiny home, but they actually go to the ADU. And then once you get a few ADUs on the ground, those people who live in them or rent them or develop them become their own advocacy group. And Kol's done a wonderful job of harnessing that energy. So once you get a few on the ground, then you start having everyone there show up and fill City Hall to get more. And I'll say I've done some work in Portland on the power of maps. And I don't know your local land use history, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to speak on that directly, but if I can advance the slide, I will. I've got a 9-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son, and sometimes I get them, put them to work coloring in. So one thing you might do is look at the history of zoning in some of the townships or the jurisdictions in Magic and just see what was, when it was originally built out, especially some of the older areas, maybe you've got a mix of different kinds of housing stock. And you only have that because when it was built out originally, the codes weren't in place that are in place today. Maybe there's some little plexes or ADUs. This is another example from Portland where we just highlighted in the areas of the city that were originally zoned single family, and then they were made into multi-dwelling, but there's a lot of multi-dwelling development everywhere else except for those single family zoned areas. And this is an overlay of original single family zoned areas and areas that are now being proposed for historic designation, seeing that they're both kind of land use tools that sometimes keep anything from changing in the neighborhood. The historic landmark designation is something that there's some concerns about in our city, that it may be, encasing some neighborhoods in amber in a way that could limit housing choices in those neighborhoods. And although data doesn't necessarily change the mind of decision makers, storytelling does a much better job of that. It is critical to helping them, build the case for policy changes. So we found that some cities don't even know how many ADUs that they have or how many they permitted. On the left, you can see Portland's keeping up track of them. So we know that we went from, 10 or 20 a year up to, more than one per day. Because we keep track. Some cities that we've looked at, like Washington, D.C., they just have a hard time with the record system to even know how many are getting built. And some of the other items I did mention before can make a difference to decision makers. And this is some of the examples of stuff that, to get this information, you have to study it. I know Boston is awash in universities, so hopefully someone there can get some local data. Oregon Department of Environmental Quality did a great study, and Portland State University did a more recent update of it to see who lives in ADUs. Are they actually being used for housing versus just like man caves or short-term rentals or other uses that are not long-term? So here's an idea of who lives in them. Quite a range of ages, actually. You'll see 24% of people are young folks, 25 to 34 years old, and 15% are over 55. So you've got at all age groups, people are there. And even in a city like Portland, where we have no owner occupancy requirement for ADUs, we know, if I can get to this next slide, that 70% are owner occupied anyway. That's oftentimes a code question jurisdictions have to grapple with. And we've learned that back in 1996, Portland dropped the owner occupancy requirement because it turned out it didn't really matter very much. Parking is oftentimes raised, and when we get to the code part of this discussion, we can get in there a little more deeply, but we have learned that ADUs on average have low parking demands for residents compared to other housing types. And then what we really get to know in studying ADUs is who actually builds them. And I'm going to do a little handoff to Kol now, but to say that they're really a unique housing type that I think one of the reasons that a lot of communities are more comfortable allowing ADUs is because it's not something that just like your standard meat and potato home builder can jump in there and build 80 of them in a neighborhood. They're actually pretty hard to build, and they're built by amateurs, homeowner amateurs who are inspired by their life situation or by wanting to take on a big project beyond a kitchen renovation or economics to afford to live in that neighborhood to do what for them is a pretty big project. So Kol, do you want to take it here?
Yeah, sure. And, you know, I think another interesting aspect of why this is the audience of people who are developing ADUs is that ADUs, at least to date, we don't have any evidence to show in terms of the valuation of properties with ADUs that they sell for more than it costs to build the ADU. In other words, if you bought a $500,000 property, built a $200,000 ADU, we don't have evidence to date to show that those properties would sell for more than $700,000. So if that's the case, if they're not actually adding more value than they cost to build, it would not be in a spec developer's best interest financially to buy a property, single-family property, add an ADU, and sell it because they would lose their shirt. So who's, you know, just on a purely economic level, for those who are building it just for rental income, which is a very common use, at least in Portland, it would only make sense for that person rationally, economically, if they had a long-term vested interest in the property, if they're going to be renting out the ADUs for a number of years, and then selling the property, at which point it does make financial sense. So for that reason, ADUs are kind of in a different category than every other form of housing in the United States, in that it's not developed by professional developers. It tends to be developed by amateur homeowner developers. Can we go to the next slide? So these are just examples of people that have hosted on previous ADU tours, which we've been running in Portland for, 8 years now, and we'll probably just, talk a little bit about this for a moment. These are the amateur homeowners that amateur homeowner developers that have developed ADUs on the properties. They've never developed housing before. They don't know a single thing about zoning or financing of property development. They work full-time jobs. They've probably done, minor improvements on their properties before, but never taken on developing housing units. So this is the audience of people that we need to reach in order to equip them with the skill set to become effectively developers of property, which is a really robust skill set. For those who have done developing before, you know that there's a lot of moving parts to that, and it can be a little bit daunting. And so a lot of the efforts that we've made here in Portland have been kind of using these people in mind as, these are our end users. These are the people for whom we have to make this process as easy and accessible as possible. Can we go to the next slide? So it is not easy to develop an ADU, even in a perfect regulatory environment. So let's just go through some of the obstacles to ADU development in general. So there's regulations. A lot of jurisdictions ostensibly allow ADUs, but actually effectively ban them. And I would put most of the country into that category, meaning that the codes are so restrictive in certain ways that we'll go over in a little bit more detail, that effectively, even though they're ostensibly allowed, you can't really do it. And those things can be minor, but they end up adding up. Fees, there's the collective residential impact fees, utility connection fees, and other administrative building permit fees can amount to a lot of money. And so that can be a huge obstacle. If you're an amateur homeowner developer, you've never paid $20,000 or $50,000 for anything and not seen anything in return, and that's exactly what you're being asked to do when you're developing a housing unit on your property, the biggest, most risky thing you've ever done with your money, and you're being asked to pay $50,000 before you can even, break ground. It's a little bit daunting. And then there's discretionary zoning processes that require conditional land use reviews, and in some jurisdictions, thankfully not here in Portland, but if you have those kind of processes where you have to go, in front of some public board in order to get the permission to build a housing unit, that's all the more kind of reason not to pursue that option instead of, say, adding a 800 square foot addition to your house and ending up with a 3,000 square foot house, which is not what we need. So then there's the process of climbing the learning curve of how to go through the zoning and understanding building codes and fire codes and life safety and setbacks and a lot of different stuff that people haven't dealt with before. ADUs are not cheap to do. We'll talk, in general, in the Portland market, I'd say, the cost of an ADU, which is something people are always curious about. I'm just going to say $180,000 for a 800 square foot ADU is kind of the average going price. In the Portland market, it's going to be a little bit more expensive. In the Boston market, I'm guessing. In California, it's going to be like $300,000 for that same unit. for a unit half that size, 400 square feet, in the Portland market, it would be about $140,000, and slightly more in California, maybe $200,000, and probably slightly somewhere in between in Massachusetts. And then a conversion, like a garage conversion, if you can do that, or a basement conversion, think of those as being like half that cost. So maybe an 800 square foot conversion might be $100,000 on average. And these are very broad stroke numbers. There's a lot of variables, of course, but just to get a sense of what these cost. And you're saying to yourself, wow, that's really expensive. It is really expensive. If you're an average homeowner, that is a lot of money to come up with. So it's hold in your head that it's both extremely expensive and it's also the cheapest form of housing you can possibly develop in the United States in centrally located areas. So it does hold the promise of providing an affordable, naturally affordable type of housing solution. There's very limited financing options available for ADU development right now. So people who are developing ADUs have to be able to access cash or using home equity lines of credit or cash out refinancing, which means if you've owned property for a long period of time and it's appreciated in land value, you might be able to access money to pay for it. So that's generally how people are doing it right now. We're hoping, advocates are hoping that there's going to be better financing options on the horizon. Right now, there isn't a good way to scale the production of ADUs, and there's a lot of different efforts being looked at nationally. A lot of companies, hundreds of companies are looking at how to do prefab modular ADUs, off-the-shelf stuff. Nobody's really cracked that code yet. Maybe that'll happen, but for now, it's a one-by-one process for each and every person. They've got to climb up the Herculean process of going through zoning, financing, and best practices for the design of their property, and every case is different. Every single property is different. I do this all day long. I consult with people, and I've never seen two properties that could have the same exact process or ADU on their property for various reasons. So it's a process, and that means that as a homeowner, you have to find and manage an architect and contractor. Again, a lot of people haven't dealt with using architects and GCs before, but that's something you have to get familiar with if you're going to become like the project manager for a housing unit. And then being a landlord isn't necessarily what everybody wants to be. So, it's not to say that, maybe having an ADU isn't for everybody, because a lot of people just don't want to deal with the hassle of being a landlord. Next slide, please. So in Portland, one of the things that we've done is for the last 8 years or so, I've been teaching classes for homeowners. That it's like an 8-hour class that goes through the whole development process of an ADU from A to Z, and I've taught this class to 2,000 people now. And we also run these citywide tours. This is the upper left-hand image is a picture of Eli in front of a garage conversion ADU with a big tour of people back in 2010. And subsequently, I started running kind of a more formal tour in conjunction with the city, the state, Metro, Energy Trust of Oregon, Earth Advantage, these organizations that had an interest in ADUs, and collectively we kind of promoted this tour. And lo and behold, the first tour sold out. 1,000 people showed up to check out 10 ADUs. The second year we had 20 ADUs and 2,000 people came. So we've been running this tour now for 6 years, and just a huge amount of interest in ADUs. And there's a few reasons for that. One is, the tiny house movement has kind of influenced people's interest in small housing options. But honestly, people are really curious about ADUs. If they become something that's a viable option, there is a real vast market there. And it's hard to know what that market is, but it's a lot bigger than you might think. The couple studies I've looked at have indicated that anywhere from 15 to 30% of homeowners would like a ADU on their property if they could have one. So there is a vast market, and that's been really made crystal clear to us through the demand for participating in this tour over the years. The next tour, just incidentally, will be probably in June of 2019, and so we'll have 10 or 20 ADUs on that tour, and it's the biggest tour of ADUs in the country. Next slide, please. So, another good strategy that, the tour might not be like the way to start this process, in that you kind of need a bunch of ADUs built before you can start showing them off. But one of the reasons that we like tours is that it gives homeowners access to seeing these things, which are discrete, and you don't even know that these ADUs are there unless you're invited into it and you're like, you walk into the backyard and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there's a whole other house back here which I couldn't see from the street, which is kind of the beauty of ADUs. So, and as soon as these things are built, people want to rent them out so that they can start paying off the bridge loan debts that they've incurred. So it's hard to gain access to ADUs. The other strategy that's a lot more palpable or a lot more easy, I guess, is to get local media coverage of built ADUs. So there's a lot of great stories to be told, and if you can just get one ADU built and have that homeowner be willing to talk about their story with a local media rep, those kind of personal stories have gone a long way in kind of normalizing this, unique housing form that people are not accustomed to seeing. And so having real first-person narratives of how people have used their ADUs has been really helpful in helping to, spur the interest in ADUs in this market. Next slide, please. So one of the things that a lot of cities lack is just very basic best practices for communicating on the web about ADUs. And so, these are the types of things that a simple index page on a HTML index page on a city's website should include if it wants to make the ADU development process more accessible for these average homeowner developers. How much are these things going to cost? What are the utility fees I need to know about? What are examples of permit sets? I don't know what an elevation drawing is. Can you show me an elevation drawing, please? What is a site plan? I don't know what a site plan is. What are these building codes? How does fire and life safety and that relate to my setback requirements, relate to height restrictions? What's the difference between building codes and zoning codes? And then, maybe a program guide that goes through all the different facets of what's involved in building an ADU in terms of the timeline and who you need to talk to. All those different things are pretty easy to put together, but surprisingly, a very small percentage of municipalities actually have a very simple web page that goes over this stuff. If you want to see a good example of a web page for ADUs, type in Laneway Housing, Vancouver, BC. Incidentally, Vancouver, BC is kind of the leader in North America of ADU development. Portland is kind of the leader in the U.S. for ADU development, quickly being usurped by Los Angeles, incidentally. So let's move to the next slide. So we've, in Portland, made an effort to both get local media coverage, but also build a website that is showcasing hundreds of built projects, real-life built projects, and we go over what the ADU type is, how much it costs to build, what the challenges were, how did people finance it, who did they use as their general contractor, and this has kind of served as a good repository of both best practices as well as ways for people to network and collaborate about ADUs. And Eli and I are very interested in getting more people from other jurisdictions to contribute to this website. So if you happen to want to write something about ADUs in Massachusetts that based on real life, actual built projects, please let us know, because we're always looking to expand the geographic scope of this website. This is a totally volunteer-driven effort, and it's been really successful. If other jurisdictions want to create something like this, that's great, but feel free to reach out to us if you want to just add into what we've already built. Next slide, please. That website has also helped foster a community when needed for advocacy work. So for years and for decades, getting the best practices from a regulatory, financing, and a whole bunch of other different advantages is going to be a challenge. ADUs face a lot of uphill changes that need to happen in order for them to have a viable chance of actually taking off in a significant way. And so in that regard, there's really going to need to be political advocacy for ADUs from amongst all the different stakeholders that are interested in them. That's urban planners, architects, realtors, homeowners, builders, and others. So accessory dwelling, et cetera, we've had to address political issues that have come up regarding property taxation issues, zoning code issues, and waiving our residential impact fees. We've had to do in-person meetings and get people to sign on. We've had to get people to come to City Hall. So there's definitely a real, tangible, palpable need for political advocacy from the grassroots kind of organizations that are interested in ADUs. And, you know, this gets back to what constitutes like this network or this program of people that are involved in fostering ADUs. It's really, I'd say, a best practice to have a collaboration of different entities supporting ADUs. And they can each have their own interest, you know. Maybe AARP is interested in accessible housing and affordable housing groups are interested in affordable housing. But, you know, I like to caution all the entities involved in ADUs that it's really only by virtue of kind of deregulating ADUs that we have any chance of them being built. So even if we have our own interest in ADUs, what we hope that they will solve, it's important to kind of forego some of our own interests in the greater good of actually seeing ADUs built. Maybe we'll get a chance to get more into that later. Next slide, please. So ADUs take a lot of work and a lot of effort to build. You know, it's probably, I like to describe the ADU development process as being the second biggest project of people's life after having a kid. And if you haven't had a kid, it's probably the biggest project of your life. And so people like to talk about it because it's such a big deal. And so there's a lot of water cooler talk about ADUs, and people who've been through the process are really psyched about being able to show it off to friends. And that's kind of one of the fun things about ADUs is like how excited people get about building it. And so there's definitely ways to like leverage and harness that level of engagement as people are going through the process of building it. Next slide, please. And yeah, so I forget if we're going to hand off here, Eli.
I'll jump in for a second on this.
Yeah.
This is Eli here. One of the things we're seeing nationally is a dynamic where you've got local jurisdictions sometimes take the lead to allow accessory dwelling units, but other jurisdictions say, no thanks, we're not going to do it. And there's starting to become statewide or regional efforts that require every city or jurisdiction within that geography to allow ADUs, sometimes with reasonable restrictions. Oregon and California did that at a statewide level. California originally didn't put any teeth into their statewide requirement for ADUs, but they have done so a couple years ago, and that is why LA is now going to be the leader in ADU productions, because LA just didn't bother to do it when California first required it, and finally they had to, and there was a huge latent demand to build these things, which is now expressing itself on the ground. I know that Massachusetts has been dallying with ideas on this. You guys know about this way more than I do, so I'm not going to step in there. But also in regional levels of government, you can also have a mandate. The metropolitan region that Portland sits within, which has about 17 jurisdictions in it, has required every area within this region to allow ADUs for I think, decades. So there's definitely a role of regional level governments also. And there's also a carrot side to this, not just a stick. So for one example that might be helpful in the Massachusetts area, the suburbs of Boston and Cambridge, is to provide technical assistance. So for example, recently we had a requirement by the state of Oregon to allow ADUs, and then the metro regional government provided free technical assistance to jurisdictions to help them actually write the code, do the hard work of it, which got 12 planners from different regions all together with some providers, and they just hacked out the codes one afternoon. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I think that's probably where we get into some discussion. And thanks for bearing with our little technology issues as we've gotten rolling today. But I'll hand it over to Heidi.
Okay. Let's move on back to the slides here, and I'm showing let's see if the slide is going to respond. So Kol and Eli can flip through the site designs if that's helpful here.
This can be pretty quick. I don't know if I've got the control or not, but this is one example of a really common situation where we've got an accessory dwelling unit. You can't see it from the street. It's right up against an alley. We have 0 setbacks to alleys for accessory dwelling units, just like we have 0 setback to alleys for garages. We pretty much treat them the same as structure types. But you can sort of see a standard site plan. This is a 100 by 50 foot lot where the house is set back maybe 15, 20 feet, and the ADU is behind it. It's really filling the same massing and footprint of a 2-car garage. So you can maybe go to the next one. This is a project I did. It's unusual. There's 2 single-family lots side by side, each one with a single-family. Sorry, one of the lots had a single-family house on it with a detached garage. I converted a detached garage to an accessory dwelling unit. That's in the bottom right-hand corner, so you can see that's the garage. You no longer put a car in there. And then on the left side of the site, you see in the bottom left corner, there's a new single-family house that I built, and behind it, a detached accessory dwelling unit that's on a 20 by 20 footprint, sort of where you would otherwise put a garage in the back of the property. And since they're side-by-side lots, it's basically a little community of homes. Each home's on a different corner of the property, and I use condominium ownership to separate so that they're sold separately to people, each with independent financing. You're not going to see that happen very much, but it is legally possible to do, at least here in Oregon and in Texas, where another developer has done some of these projects in Austin. Next one. This is an example that Kol shared of the really most affordable way to do accessory dwelling units. You can't even see they're there because it's a conversion, in this case, of a garage. And Kol, if you want to jump in on any of these, please do so. But it looks from the street just like it was before, a house with an ADU, a pretty modest renovation. And this is the most affordable kind of ADU you can create. And for people who are aging in their communities, garages are fantastic because they have 0-step entries. And so they're just naturally accessible and, of course, visitable. Next. This is one, some of the ADUs are used for innovative experiments in construction. This is someone who wanted to try out Portland's new allowance to do cob construction. So they built the ADU out of cob in the back corner of a property. And so this is actually a 3-bedroom ADU in 800 square feet. So they're very small bedrooms. But one thing we've learned is that although accessory dwellings are small, we cap them at 800 square feet in Portland, they oftentimes house more people than you would think. That project I showed earlier with the 20 by 20 footprint ADU is like 600 square feet. I think a person would buy it. It turned out to be a couple with their cat, and then another cat joined them, and then they had a baby, and they were about to have a second baby before they finally moved out to a larger house. And then the new couple that moved in there was had a baby also once they were there. So it's kind of a fertile environment for the other end of life where people are starting families. People who just want to live in nice, walkable neighborhoods are trying to find desperately somewhere they can afford to live, and a lot of times ADU is that option. So that's just a few examples. These are obviously Pacific Northwesty and look. I hope that we get more of a library of examples to share in Massachusetts as you guys get a few of them built. And it doesn't take that many to build the showcase. Just get a newspaper article about a couple of them, and suddenly it's on the paper, and people start seeing them. Okay, well, we kind of did our presentation first about all the reasons people do ADUs, but when you see ADUs blossoming in a community, we realize that it takes the fundamental regulations need to be in place that are pretty flexible, but it's not just the regulations that get them built. Right now, though, we're going to talk about the regulations because we got a whole bunch of planners on the line, and they're all curious what kind of rules are poison pills for ADUs, and which kind of rules let them get built, and what are some creative ways you can write codes so that they pass political muster in a community and still allow ADUs to get built. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, so regulations matter a lot. They should be simple, they should be fair, and ideally they should be by right. Let's jump into them right now. Next slide. A lot of times cities get excited to legalize ADUs, and let's go to the next slide here. And neighbors say, oh my goodness, the sky's going to fall. And the next slide. And the city says, okay, well, given the concerns here, we're going to require all these small code restrictions on ADUs. They would never apply to a single-family house. And as one illustration of that, AERP, which has been a fantastic ADU champion going back to 2000, they adopted a model code back then, and it's classic. It's about 60 pages, and half of it is about local ordinances. And they say you shouldn't require off-street parking, but if you do, here's some language for it. You shouldn't require owner occupancy, but if you do, here's some language for it. And they go down and down the list: minimum lot sizes, ownership models, by right versus discretionary. And not surprisingly, when jurisdictions actually got to writing their code, they included almost all of those just-in-case provisions. So collectively, it ended up being kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And that's what we're seeing today. So many cities now that want to really not just have codes that allow ADUs, but actually see them built on the ground, are going back and making the codes more liberal, and recognizing that even if you have a really set of liberal codes, they're still not going to get used all that much. Let's go to the next one. So the basic code, ADU codes, there's not that many things to tune in them. There's not that many factors. The first question is, where are they allowed in the city? We already talked about this, so I'll be swift. What types of houses can add ADUs? Which zones? Where geographically can they be located? And if there's minimum lot sizes. Our general recommendation is to allow it to be all houses, and regardless of the lot size. Other dynamics that come up in this discussion are, can you do internal ADUs only, additions, detached ADUs? Once again, more flexibility is better and allows you to recognize the existing, what's on the property. It helps you to be able to design around a tree, for example, if you can do an internal ADU. If you have a big yard, then external ones make a lot of sense. The number of ADUs, most communities allow one. Some communities are starting to allow two. Vancouver, BC allows one internal and one detached ADU per lot. You're increasingly seeing cities do that in the West Coast of the United States, but it's probably not the first step for you. Next. What types of ADUs? I guess we already talked about this. There's quite a variety that can be constructed, and the simplest way to do a code is to allow them all. Then people don't have to keep track of which one in one suburb, zero only allow internal, one suburb detached. And then there's some rarely used provisions that are helpful. One of them is that if you have an existing house that's small, you can allow that house to become the ADU of the new home to be built on the site. So that's one way of providing an economic way you can preserve a really small existing house, which otherwise would likely be scraped off the site and replaced. The other is to allow ADUs, whether it's converting an older building or adding something to the older building, or letting it be built as part of new construction, a house with an ADU built inside of it or to the side or behind it. Next. Dimensional standards. It's pretty common to cap the height of them at around 18, 20, sometimes 25 feet. Portland allowed them up to 18 feet for a while. We just bumped it up to 20. It's important when you think about a height limit to compare it to other detached structures that could be built on a property. So if you have a situation where the tallest ADU you could build is 18 feet, but if it's not an ADU, you could build it 30 feet high, then you won't be too surprised to find people building 30-foot tall art studios and then effectively using them as ADUs. If you ratchet down the ADU, or if the ADU has to match the design of the existing house, but it doesn't have to match it if it's a garage, then sure enough, you'll start seeing people build garages or other structures and using them like ADUs. Not necessarily a great path to go down. And then for square footage, usually they're about 600 to 800 to 1,000 square foot caps on ADUs. It's important to have a cap for the politics and to have neighborhood acceptance. And we have 800 square feet in Portland. Some communities also have a restriction that the ADU can't be more than a third the size of the main house. We used to have that in Portland, or some small fraction. Think that one through if you're going to have that in your code, because it effectively becomes a small house penalty. If you have a 1,200 square foot house, it means the biggest ADU you could build is 400 square feet, which may be just too small to be feasible. Whereas if you have a big house, then you can do an ADU twice the size. So in Portland, we got rid of that requirement. Now it's 75% of the main house size, or 800 square feet, whatever is less. And then sometimes you can have an exception for basement situations where if the house, you're doing the ADU in the basement, maybe just let it be the same size as the house above. Jump in, someone?
Yeah, can I jump in for a second, Eli?
Yeah, please.
Cole. So regarding the height limits, I just wanted to be clear about this. So whether you're measuring at the, the height limit in Portland is measured 20 feet at the midpoint of the gable, 25 feet is another standard that can be used for the peak of the gable. But the point is, you want to have a standard that allows, if you're going to do if you're going to allow detached ADUs, you want to allow 2-story ADUs, which admittedly, will cause some political backlash, I'm sure, but it's important to allow 2-story ADUs. And so depending on how the code is written, you would want to allow for 25-foot height at the peak of the roof or 20 feet at the midpoint of the gable. And then regarding size, I think the driver there is to think about, in terms of the economics of ADUs, nobody's going to build an ADU if they can't fit a bedroom in it, and you can't really easily do a 1-bedroom unit unless it's at least 600 square feet. And I would go so far as to say you can't reasonably expect a lot of people to want most couples are going to want, at least 600 square feet, if not 800 square feet. So to really serve a broader market, you're going to want to have a limit that is allowing at least 600 square feet, if not 800 square feet. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. One other creative thing we did here in Portland is we said that if the ADU is 1-story, then does not have any design compatibility requirements at all, just like we wouldn't require that for a garage. But if you go to 2 stories, then you have to start matching the existing house in some ways, like roof pitch, siding treatment, window orientation, trim. Those only come into play if you're building a taller ADU. In setbacks, we tend to just say that we have the same rules whether you're building an ADU or you're building a garage or any other detached accessory structure, just trying to balance the scales between ADUs and other things people build in their properties. Next. So if you are going to have design compatibility requirements, I think it's great to make these, it's a little hard to write them, but make them by right rather than discretionary. It's just got to match, because discretionary opens it up to neighbors claiming that it doesn't look close enough to the existing house. But also it should acknowledge some situations where the existing house is fugly, as a friend of mine would say. If the existing house is got T111 siding and no trim around the windows, do you really want to force the ADU to match that? So one strategy can be to provide an alternate, either design it to match the existing house or meet some community design standard that's prescriptive that would tend to look just fine in that neighborhood. That gives you an either-or approach. But clear and objective standards are important, and this is partly based on ADUs being built by amateurs again. The last thing someone wants to do is to propose an ADU and they have to go through a process where they have to notify all their neighbors about it and potentially get people screaming at them. If you can build a single-family house by right or do an addition to the single-family house by right, then there's a good case to say, well, why should an ADU be any different? Next. We've already talked about parking, so I'm going to skip that for now unless people have questions afterwards. But this is where we've, at the bottom of this slide, mentioned the flexibility to configure off-street spaces in tandem or to provide an on-street parking credit as a way that you can demonstrate you've got enough space for the car whether or not it's on your particular property. Next. Question of who can live on the property. Owner occupancy we've discussed before. Also, some communities have maximum number of people who can be in a household. Portland's got fairly liberal rules on that, although I wish we would just get rid of them entirely. But you can have up to 6 people on a property, up to 5 unrelated, and plus as many as you want related by family in some weird definition. But one approach you could take is just say that whatever your definition of a household is, it extends to the collective occupancy of the house and the ADU, which sometimes makes neighbors more comfortable with the idea that, but if you've got a really strict requirement on what a household is, then that might not be flexible enough. Next. So short-term rentals, we talked about that a little before. Affordability restrictions. A lot of times, this happened in Santa Cruz when they were legalizing ADUs. Communities think, oh my goodness, what a great housing type. We're going to allow ADUs as long as they're affordable to people at 60% of median income, and for 10 years or something like that. And what you run into is a really, and this is coming from me who did affordable housing development for over a decade, it's not a good idea to try and encumber, require that homeowners do income screening of tenants, and then they all and then also put a deed restriction on their property that's going to last for a certain amount of time. There's good reasons why affordable housing that's regulated in that manner is done by professionals, and usually there's some efficiencies of scale. Communities that have tried to make this a precondition of doing ADUs find that they don't get any built, because that's not an easy learning curve to climb, in addition to all the other challenges of building an ADU. So as much as I love affordable housing, I think that ADUs provide affordable housing in a different way. And mixing those regulated affordable housing with ADUs is probably a good way to not get any built. And then I think I talked about by right rules already. So yeah, let's go to the short-term rental, get a general policy, and then if you need to do special treatment for ADUs, then do so, but hopefully not too much. And then the overall approach is to look at your regulations. Obviously, the ones I pitched are really, you'd end up with a pretty easy, simple, unrestricted set of regulations for accessory dwelling units. But we recognize that every community's got some third-rail issue, whether it's student housing or design aesthetic or owner occupancy. And one political strategy is just to say that, you know, we can have one of these, what I'll call poison pills in our rule, but let's not put them all in. And that way you can give sort of community members who are concerned about ADUs something that they can say, yeah, we got that into the code. But if we have enough experience from the past 2 decades that if you put all these little restrictions in, even though each one doesn't seem too substantial, then you get situations where they never get built. There are a lot of communities that have allowed ADUs for 2 decades and not never seen one, except maybe 1 or 2 of them ever constructed. Next. So let's just keep going on resources here. Next. Because this is just 2 slides. One of them is I have on my website a page where I just open source the advocacy, and you guys are going to be writing your own letters to the editor and talking points. But if you don't want to reinvent the wheel, just go steal some of the ones that we've done out here in the Northwest. You can find some here, and if you have others to share that go over well, then feel free to send them over to add to the list. And next one, slide. I did a report with the state of Oregon on ADUs and several other types of space-efficient, character-compatible infill housing options in single-dwelling neighborhoods. A totally policy-wonky name for a document, but you can download it for free, and it's got a whole chapter on accessory dwelling units, and it includes a discussion of the code options and the best practices and the balancing of dynamics, where the more you regulate, the fewer you see built, and how you can sort of tune that to something that will work in your community. It's also got a series of a few examples of case studies, and I think with some site plans as well that you can use as a free resource. And if you're thinking about other types of ways to get more affordable housing and smaller options in your existing communities, those other things on the list are also great ideas. So accessory dwelling units seem to be the most popular right now, but cottage clusters are great. You guys have a few examples in New England. Corner duplexes make a lot of sense, as do internal home conversions.